Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts, a podcast where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing awareness, growth, and healing. You may hear information from professionally licensed therapists, life coaches, healers, doctors, etc. This information is not medical advice or therapy and is not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given by a doctor or a personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalon Johnson. My guest today is Dr. Alex Howard. Dr. Howard is a globally recognized author, speaker, and therapeutic coach whose groundbreaking work sits at the intersection of trauma healing, nervous system health, and human transformation. Dr. Howard is the founder of the Optimum Health Clinic, one of the world's leading integrative medicine clinics specializing in fatigue and trauma-related conditions. With over 2 decades of clinical experience and a deeply personal journey of his own, Dr. Howard has helped thousands of people reclaim their lives by healing at the level of the nervous system and beyond. As a survivor of his own childhood trauma and chronic illness, Dr. Howard's path was not one of textbook theories. It was one carved out of necessity. At 16, after years of pushing through emotional pain and disconnect, his body collapsed. And that moment marked the beginning of a radical healing journey that would evolve into a body of work dedicated to helping others do the same. In his best-selling books, including It's Not Your Fault and Decode Your Fatigue, he redefines healing, not as symptom management, but as a return to wholeness. Dr. Howard is the curator of Therapeutic Coaching, an integrative methodology that bridges psychology, somatic therapy, and parts work to support people in healing deep-rooted trauma and reprogramming emotional patterns that no longer serve them. Through his podcasts, live events, and online programs, he reaches millions around the world with tools that blend science with the soul and theory with lived truth. In a world that too often tells us to push through pain and override the body's wisdom, Dr. Howard is a voice of grounded, compassionate authority, showing us that recovery isn't just possible, it's our birthright. So, Dr. Howard, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for being my guest.
Jalon, thank you for having me, and that was a beautiful intro. So thank you. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. I did give a bit of an introduction, but so that the audience can get to know you a little bit better, would you mind giving us a little bit of background about yourself and how you got to who and where you are today?
So this wasn't my life plan. So I loved music as a kid. So my passion was I wanted to be a musician. And then in my mid to late teens, I started having debilitating physical symptoms, particularly fatigue, but also partly as a result of suffering from what's called a medically unexplained illness. Anxiety, depression, and then sort of came to realize over time that I had significant childhood trauma that also hadn't been processed. And I think, like a lot of people, going on a massive healing journey, firstly, I'd missed the chance to become a rock star, but also I wanted to give meaning to the journey that I had been on. And, early on in that journey, I was looking for the answer, like particularly the answer to my physical symptoms, but also in time, the answer to sort of the anxiety, the trauma, the other things that were happening. What I came to realize is there's not one answer, or there are as many answers. And really that's become my body of work. And that's become, for the last 20 plus years, has become my passion. That healing is possible, but healing often has to happen on multiple levels. And so for the last 20 or so years, as you mentioned, I've been running a clinic. I also run a professional training program. But I've also, in more recent years, had a real passion for really trying to take that work to more people. I often think about myself at my most desperate moments. What would be the messages, but also the mediums to deliver those messages that would have really made the difference? And so that's why I'm here, and that's why I'm so passionate about this work.
Thank you so much for sharing that. You mentioned a little bit about your early life, and I think a lot of us who have had maybe a difficult upbringing, we may not necessarily classify it as childhood trauma because we think it has to look a certain way. And that can not serve a lot of us in actually healing, because we're maybe dismissing what happened, and it won't allow us to get to the root of our problems. So I wanted to touch on that a little bit more. Before your work and the research, like, I wanted to talk about your story. Like, who was young Alex, and what was your earliest understanding of love and safety?
It's, I've reflected on my childhood in so many different ways over the years, be it sort of teaching, writing, but also my own sort of therapeutic journey. And I think perhaps like it is for many people, there were of course very painful, difficult things that happened, but there were also the blessings that happened sort of in the midst of that. And so for me, it took me many years to realize this, but one of the things that had the biggest impact was growing up without a father. And I think it's an interesting point that often we think we don't miss things that we never had, right? It's like if you have something and it's taken away, you clearly feel the kind of the void or the absence of that thing. But when one grows up without a parent, with a particular parent, that thing wasn't there and then taken, well, it was there and taken, but you didn't have the experience of knowing that thing. And so it wasn't until, for me, my late teens, when I was doing some of my own therapeutic, as a client, experiencing my own therapeutic work, that I came to realize that there was a huge void that was left by not having a father, not learning what it was to be a young man, learning what it was then in time to become a man. But also one of the impacts of that was a sort of parentification where I had to become an adult at a young age because there wasn't that sort of strong, loving, attentive, holding father figure. But the absence of that also meant there was a lot of other mess that was going on. My mum was working 3 jobs under a lot of sort of financial and emotional pressure. My sister developed very severe mental health issues, which caused a lot of instability in the family system. So a lot of my early life was shaped by the absence of this, of something critically important, having a father, but also the sort of aftermath and the sort of chaos that created. But there were also blessings, and my grandmother, it's been such an interesting journey over the years, because for many years I had a lot of, probably rage is the right word, towards my grandmother, because she was a very sort of dominating figure. A lot of my sort of childhood issues around self-esteem were developed by this kind of relentless pressure. And if you're not top of the class, why, it's kind of, but at the same time, this is something I've come to more really to realize in more recent years, as my own kids have sort of been growing up, of some of my memories of sort of love and safety were also with my grandmother. And there's sort of moments of, if we got sick and we couldn't go to school because my mum was working, we'd go to my grandparents' house and we'd sort of get sweetly looked after and get made nice homemade food and sort of, and so there was I had blessings in my childhood, and there were significant impacts. But I think for a lot of people, we normalize to what is our normal. But what is our normal is not necessarily what's optimum or even necessary for healthy emotional development. And so we can think we have no trauma, or we can think that everything was fine because we normalized to it. And it's really through my own kind of inner work, but also my work developing kind of maps and frameworks, that one comes to realize that so many of the things that cause us pain and suffering in our lives now are not necessarily actually the things that happened, but the things that we learned from the things that happened. And so we're all shaped, whether we like it or not. We're all shaped by those experiences and by either the thing, and that's another, I think, important point. I think about it as trauma as the things that happened, but childhood emotional neglect is the things that didn't happen that we needed to have happened. So it isn't necessarily just bad things happening. It's also an absence of kind of good things that didn't happen.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And something you said is that, and you kind of just touched on this a little bit. The impact of trauma is not the events themselves, but the way we relate ourselves. The way we relate to ourselves because of them, which is so profound. And it's almost one of those things to where like something can happen to you, and you start to your identity shapes because of those things, instead of saying, okay, well, that happened to me, how do I get through this and move on? You kind of become your experiences, which can be really damaging. Was there a point in your life where you realized that was happening to you, or had happened?
Hindsight's always a wonderful thing. I think it's a pretty special person that can see these things as they're happening. But I look back, particularly in my early teenage years, partly because of the absence of a father, partly because of growing up in a sort of somewhat tumultuous environment, I was very keen to be sort of validated and sort of particularly, seen by other kids. And so I would sort of try to get attention, often in ways that then would get me laughed at or criticized or, judged. And bullying, I guess, is the sort of maybe the more technical term for it. And so there was definitely a sort of chapter of the absence of a sense of sort of self-love, and the kind of cultivation of self-love is really a product of feeling the love of the environment around us. And it's not as simple as being told that we're loved, because you can be told that you're loved and still not feel love. It's particularly when we learn that love is determined by things that we do, not love inherently for who we are, right? And so I had this sort of kind of coexisting force of this very dominating grandmother who really wanted better for me and could see that I perhaps wasn't thriving in ways that I could. And so the resolution was sort of to apply more pressure. So I'm kind of learning that my worth is determined by what I do. And then I'm trying to do things to sort of win affection that's then getting me rejected and sort of laughed at and then sort of attacked for. So I can look back and see a chapter where it was just like, how do I win at this thing called life? Right? And I think, again, it's probably a common experience for a lot of people that we feel deficient inside of ourselves. So we try to fill that deficient place from what we try to get from outside of us. But it's like the very things that we do to do that actually leave us feeling more in need and more vulnerable as a result.
Amen to that. You've been very open about your struggles with chronic fatigue, emotional collapse, and burnout. When did your body first say, I can't keep doing this?
So I started chronic fatigue happened just before I turned 16. And, again, hindsight being a wonderful thing, I can look back and I can see for some years leading into that, I was having digestive issues and some other kind of sort of early signs. But the real physical collapse happened actually really quite quickly. I was just completing a sort of big set of exams that we do here in the UK that you do it as you kind of transition from age 15 to 16. They're called GCSEs. And I was just towards the end of those exams, and I just woke up one morning, and actually so we start drinking younger in the UK than we do in the US. So our legal age is 18 to you're 21, which means we start at 16, 15, 16 typically. So I was just sort of starting to experiment with, alcohol and, whatever. And I'd been out drinking with my then girlfriend the night before, and I thought I was hungover. But then this hangover just didn't go. And it was like, I was fatigued, I was dizzy. There was a kind of anxiety reaction that kind of happened in response to that. But initially, going to the doctor, and the sort of assessment is, well, you have a virus, you just need to wait, you're going to feel better. And so for the first kind of month or two, it was just kind of feeling crappy, but just waiting for it to pass. It was kind of sort of 3 months in when I started back at school for the sort of next sort of chapter of education. And I was just so clearly unwell. I mean, like a weekend, I didn't literally collapse on the floor, but I came home one day and I just couldn't really function. And then it was about a 7-year journey from that point to get back to the point of sort of full health.
What did that emotional collapse look like, and what was the road to rebuilding like?
I think the physical collapse came first. The emotional collapse came a number of months later. That's not to say there weren't emotional elements in the physical collapse, but in terms of like the sequence of how I experienced it. And the emotional collapse in part was the kind of the dawning of the reality of how severe the physical collapse was, and that I couldn't just push my way through it. So I spent a couple of years then waiting for sort of the medical world to find the answers. And, my grandmother being, looking back, I mean, sort of extraordinarily sort of innovative in the sense I was seeing, this was the kind of mid-90s, and I was going off and seeing nutritionists and naturopaths and sort of alternative healers and so on. But after a couple of years, I really hadn't made any meaningful progress. And certainly from an emotional point of view, if anything, I was worse because I'd spent 2 years being ill and not having answers as to why I was ill. And I basically, sort of quite a long story cut short, I was having a conversation with my uncle, which really helped me realize that if I wanted the circumstances of my life to be different, I could wait for someone else to find the answers, but I might be waiting my whole life for that to happen. And at this point, I was 2 years in, I was turning around the age of 18, and I just reached a point of total desperation. Like I can't, this can't be my life. And so I made this commitment that I was going to make my healing journey the single most important thing in my life until I got well. And so, I went from watching, 7 hours of TV a day. And I should also make the point, this was 1998. This was before the world of good television, right? Imagine TV back in the late 90s. It wasn't the world that we have these days. 7 hours of TV these days doesn't seem quite so bad. But I sort of, I could see how much time I was just using, sort of numbing out from the world. And I started meditating every day. I started practicing yoga most days. I started getting really into psychology. I started reading lots and lots of books on sort of personal development and sort of spirituality and so on. And as I said a little bit in the introduction, I was initially just trying to find the answer. What I came to realize is that particularly with a complex chronic illness like chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia or so forth, they're so multifaceted that there are different stages to the recovery process. There are different bodily systems impacted. There are different types of tiredness. And these are all maps that over the years we developed at the Optimum Health Clinic. But at the time, it was a lot of trial and error, a lot of persistence, and a lot of desperation that meant that even if I wanted to give up, I couldn't give up, because giving up meant that I was surrendering to something that I didn't feel I could surrender to. So yeah, it was at the time an incredibly difficult journey, but it was also an extraordinary journey, because I look back on that time and I think of all the wonderful things in my life now are because of those years of incredibly hard inner work.
What do you think that taught you about the connection between the mind and the body, and how do you feel that kind of bled over into the books you've written and diving into like a deep dive into trauma-informed healing? Like, do you think that maybe your experiences kind of inspired you to do the writing and helping of others?
Certainly. I think initially I was incredibly skeptical and I'd say defensive about the idea that what was happening in my mind and emotions was impacting my physical body. Because when you're suffering from what certainly in those days would be classified as a medically unexplained illness, the typical explanation you get is this isn't real, it's in your mind. Right. And so anyone then suggesting that there's a psychology role, it was like, no, you don't understand my experience. The sort of constant state of being kind of gaslit by people and kind of judged by people. And so I was really defended against that as an idea. And I had this philosophy at the time that if I'm really serious about my healing journey, then I can't afford to leave any stone unturned. So what that means is that even though I may not like that as a possibility, I still have to properly pursue that as a possibility. Now, what happened for me was then I sort of joke, if music was my first love, psychology was my second love. And I just, partly because for the first time I could explain so many of the things in my life that were difficult. I could understand my family system in a different way. I could understand my own experience in a different way. I really got into a lot of, I guess, what you could kind of classify as a sort of positive psychology or sort of psychology of change. So I was, although I did my undergraduate degree and at the time my PhD in sort of more traditional psychology, the idea that you just talk about the problem never really excited me. But I was incredibly excited by people that were developing methods and frameworks that really could create change. And so I sort of went from this defended, resistant, that's nothing to do with it, to a totally evangelist in a way for the possibility that we all have to create meaningful change in our lives. And certainly it's informed my writing and my content over the years. And I think partly because for me, what's important, again, sort of touch on something I said a little bit earlier, when I'm making content, I'm trying to make content in a way that I think is, it's not just theoretically helpful, but it's actually meaningful and useful to the people that I'm talking to. And, I sort of hold in my own mind that younger me, and would what I'm saying pass his bullshit detector? Is this just kind of, me as a psychologist pontificating, or is this actually something that he would listen to and go, maybe that could work? So I'm always trying to find that balance between making sure my work is grounded in research and grounded in sort of real world application, but also it's actually going to be accessible and it's actually going to make a meaningful difference.
I think that's important. And especially if you've had chronic illness that may be stemming from emotional discord in the body, and you've gone to see doctors and you've been gaslit, and then you find the answers yourself, there's no one really to talk to. You can't go back to the doctors and say, I did some yoga or some meditation and now the pain in my stomach is gone. They're going to look at you like, okay, well, who cares, or what have you, because the system isn't designed to allow you to actually heal if you're not like on a prescription or if you're not constantly seeing doctors. So what has it been like for you to find the answers and to be rooted in trying to make sure that your younger self will be able to listen to you and find good answers?
Yeah, something that's always been important to me is maintaining humility about the fact that, a lot of the areas that I work in, like complex chronic illness, trauma, and so on, these are complex areas that are very, very multifaceted. And anyone that claims to have all the answers, or perhaps even worse, the answer, like there's a single answer to these things, I think is really revealing one of really two things: either revealing their stupidity and their naivety, that how little they know, or they're revealing their sort of arrogance and their sort of over inflatedness. And, in the first sort of decade or so of running the Optimum Health Clinic, I was pretty anti sort of mainstream medical world, partly because of my own experience and all those years of going to see doctors and sort of being sort of judged or sort of, just massively unhelped, but also having this very sort of domineering grandmother. I really don't like being told what to do. I really don't like it. And so, going back, I'm trying to remember roughly exactly when now, but let's say going back over the last 10 years or so, it's like, I've also really worked to go, where are a philosopher called Ken Wilber, who influenced a lot of my work in my early years, and this great phrase that no one is stupid enough to be wrong 100% of the time. So to put it a different way, like everyone's got pieces of the jigsaw, and if I get hit by a bus when I'm cycling home from work after this interview, I want a mainstream medical doctor. Please, can I have painkillers? If I require a surgery, please, can I have the best surgeon in London to do the surgery? Like, I want that world. But if I've got a family member that's got a complex chronic illness, I also recognize many of the limitations of that world. And so to me, what's important is, in a way, trying to avoid anyone getting ultra rigid in like, this is the answer or this is the jigsaw piece. And, you know, one of the questions I'm often asking myself when I'm working with my own patients clinically is, what am I missing here? Like, I think I can see what's going on, but what are the bits that I'm missing? Because, you know, it's true in our own lives. Often the thing that we pay the least attention to is often the thing that is causing us the most problems. And so, you know, being integrative doesn't just mean that we work with the mind and the body. Yes, that's part of it, but we're also constantly looking for what are the pieces that are missing here, because we want to have, you know, like on my own journey, I couldn't afford to leave any stone unturned. And so when it comes to interfacing with and working with other medical professionals, sometimes you work with people that are incredibly closed-minded, but they exist in all disciplines. But you also find the incredible people who are always learning and always trying to figure out, and you know, they're the people that innovate, and you know, they're the people that still inspire me to this day.
Thanks for sharing that. I mean, it's so important. It really is. In your book, Decode Your Fatigue, you talk about chronic illness as communication. How can someone begin to understand what their body is trying to say to them?
You know, I think particularly when one has sort of medically unexplained symptoms like fatigue. And I use that phrase, by the way, not because I think there aren't explanations, but because in a traditional medical lens, often those people get told that they can't with them. It is often a clue that there is something, or more likely some things, that are out of balance, right? It's like our available energy is going down. So we want to understand why. And often what one, having, you know, over the years looked at thousands of cases of fatigue-related conditions, nearly always one looks back and you see the warning signs going into it. If there's what's called a gradual onset of fatigue, you can obviously gradually see that fatigue becoming more severe. In my instance, what we'd call a sudden onset, where it almost appears like it's coming out of nowhere, there's nearly always a series of factors that have led up to that. Like one of the analogies that we use, it's like a boat with too many loads on it. And it's not any one load that caused the boat to sink. And often people will fixate on the last thing that happened. They'll be like, oh, well, I got COVID and then I now have long COVID. And that's the reason why I have fatigue. Or someone will say, you know, I was fine. And then, you know, we got divorced and it was really stressful. And then I had fatigue afterwards. But people will typically fixate on the last thing that happened. But there's nearly always a series of other loads, like too many loads on the boat, that have got to that point. So part of the communication is, rather than seeing the body as something like a machine that needs to be dictated to, it's seeing it as a relationship, you know. And often a really important part of the healing journey is one needs to learn to listen to their body, right? So the body says rest. But if we're defining our self-worth by what we do and what we achieve, the body says rest, and we say, no, I've got to hit this deadline, or I've got to go and, you know, or let's say that we find safety in the world by what we do and how we help and support other people. Like we've got a big people pleaser pattern, or in trauma, what we'd call a fawning pattern. And our body says rest, but our people-pleasing pattern says, no, but this person's in need and I've got to go and do this and I've got to go and do that. And so we're kind of constantly overriding our body. And over a period of time, with too many loads on that body, it gets more and more drained and more depleted. So the listening to our body is a stage on the recovery journey. Is we need to get back to the point, wherever this point is, and often it's a lower point than we would like it to be. But we have to get back to a point where we are creating more energy than we're spending in a day. You know, it's like someone going into debt because they're constantly spending more money than they have available. You can't then just stop the overspending because you're still in debt. You've now got to pay off the debt. And the only way you pay off the debt is by earning more money than you spend. So a part of the pathway out of fatigue-related conditions, there's many other pieces to this jigsaw, but part of the journey out is we have to listen to our body enough that we're now building more energy than we're spending, so we can start to build up our energy reserves. Our body can use that energy for healing. But we can only do that if there's an actual communication that's happening. And often the problem is people don't listen because they don't like what their body's telling them. But they don't like what their body's telling them because they've been ignoring it. It's like being in an abusive relationship where you've been abusing someone for years, and then they go, okay, now my turn to talk. You're like, I don't want to hear it. They're like, well, let me tell you all the things that you've said to me and done to me over these years. Like, ouch, please stop. I need some time. So, that pathway, opening up that pathway and facilitating that communication is often a piece of that jigsaw.
I think that also, not only do we not want to listen to what our body is saying to us, but we may lie to ourselves.
Yeah.
And I think that can be really dangerous. And that's something you've talked about before too. What are some of the most common unconscious beliefs that you've seen that can shape the way we see ourselves?
Yeah, I think firstly, it's important to say this goes back, as we talked about earlier, it goes back to what we learnt. And often the trauma or the neglect is not what happened, it's the things that we learned to do in response to what happened, right? So examples of these types of lies could be that the world is not a safe place, so I need to withdraw. Or another one might be the world is not a safe place, so it's only safe if I'm in control. Or it might be that you only get love from other people when you are constantly attentive to all of their needs and validate and take care of them. Like, to get something back, you constantly have to give it to other people first. Or we learn that the way that we find a place of safety is by living in our head, and that we have to constantly try to think our way, or attempt to, because it doesn't work, but attempt to think our way to a feeling of safety. So we disconnect from our body and we're constantly analyzing the world because we're trying to find safety. But all we're really doing is disconnecting from our own inner safety, and we're creating more unsafety as a result of doing it. So these lies are the things that we learn to do to survive childhood. But think about it like this. It's like the walls of defense that we built to keep ourselves safe become the walls of the prison that trap us in our adult life. So it's like we learned to do this stuff to survive childhood, right? To learn to get the things that we needed that we didn't get. The problem then becomes is the very strategies that once helped us now become the strategies that are perpetuating our cycle of suffering.
Wow. That's deep. And if you really think about it, it makes sense. And it's very hard to escape from, because it takes a lot of work to, number one, be honest, to acknowledge what you're doing, and then to be humble enough to say, okay, I need help and I need resources. And something that a lot of us do is use spirituality as a way to avoid. And you've talked about spiritual bypassing and the danger of that, because it doesn't allow us to feel the things that we need to feel. In your opinion, why is it important to feel it all first?
There's a sort of short answer and long answer. The short answer is you can't heal what you don't feel. The sort of longer answer, so I kind of unpack that, is that it's like, think about it like this. Let's say we're on our life journey, and there's a massive boulder in front of us. We can try and go over it, and we can try and go around it, but we're still leaving that massive boulder that's in the way. And it's not my point, spiritual practices that give us sort of transcendental experiences can have their place, right? They give us tastes of what the world could be when we're not caught in our sort of human conditioning and suffering and so on. But my observation is when people's primary inner work is a sort of spiritual transcending or so forth, is their day-to-day life still stays a problem. to make the point in a slightly different way, many years ago, I had a girlfriend who was very much into raw food and juice fasting, and she'd found that doing a juice fast really helped sort of clear her mood and help balance her emotions and so on. So we started running into problems in our relationship, to which her resolution was to go on a juice fast. And I was like, well, there's a problem in the relationship. You starving yourself and just drinking vegetable juice for 3 days doesn't deal with a problem in the relationship. And, some of the most relationally, it sounds like a technical term, relationally challenged, which is my polite way of saying not very skillful in relationship people that I've met over the years, are people that have done many hundreds or thousands of hours of meditation practice, and that is their only inner work. Now, people that haven't done contemplative meditative practices will likely get a real benefit from doing that. I'm a huge fan of these practices, and in no way am I trying to speak against them. But one's ability to, particularly if they're more transcendental rather than embodied practices, one's ability to access certain states of consciousness doesn't necessarily make you more kind and compassionate, doesn't make you more authentic necessarily. And the only way that I've seen that most reliably works to create change in someone's life is to deal with the actual issues in their life, which is normally harder in the short term and infinitely better in the medium to long term. I was having a conversation with someone just a few days ago about parenting, and I'm always a little nervous to use an example like this because it could all change. But right now, I'm incredibly privileged to have a 8-year-old daughter, nearly 12-year-old daughter, and a 14-year-old daughter, and all are thriving and doing great at this point. And we're at a chapter in our. I feel like if I could just bottle or freeze life at this point, I would do so, because it's family life is such a wonderful source of joy at this chapter. And the conversation I was having with a friend was like, it's almost like the harder one works at parenting in the early years and do the best they can. And obviously, we all make mistakes, but it's like you reap the rewards of that as you have kids that are hopefully have basic good self-esteem and know how to self-regulate. Now, of course, there are parents that have kids that have complex neurodiversities or complex other things. My point is not that how well regulated your kids are is 100% reflection of your parenting, because we've got friends of ours, a few different situations where wonderful people, great parents, and really complex, difficult situations. So I'm not trying to be overly reductionistic about this point, but my point is that we do the hard things in the short term, we put the work in the short term, and then we reap the benefit. Hopefully, we reap the rewards and reap the benefits from doing that. And inner work is hard work. It's like being in a long-term relationship. I a good few years ago, I sort of sat back and was like, who of my friends, both in my side, I sort of have this interesting odd life where I have my sort of business friends, people that I know that are entrepreneurs and build companies and so on. Then I have my sort of spiritual friends, like my friends from my sort of like kind of, inner kind of work over the years. And I was like, who do I know that has a long-standing intimate relationship that I look at and go, I would like a relationship like that? And it's a good question for us all to ask ourselves, because it was shocking how few examples there actually were. And the people that I did know that I'd had conversations with, they would all say, I worked really hard at it. We as a team, we worked really hard at it. The real problem with spiritual bypassing is you actually suffer more, because you put a lot of work into avoiding doing the real work. So you're doing the work, you're putting effort in, but you're not actually getting the benefits that come from doing the work.
I think when we avoid, we actually just allow the problem to fester more. And, then we have the fallout of emotional collapse or physical collapse or some sort of breakdown. And something I heard once is that what's in the way is the way.
Yeah.
And so if we can see an issue as something to lean into instead of something to avoid, regardless of how painful it is or how difficult it is to maybe sit with ourselves, at some point the energy that we're putting into avoiding it has to shift into actually going to fix that issue.
Yeah, it's like one of the ways we talk about it in my business life is make sure you're solving the right problem.
Mm.
Because sometimes we work really hard solving the wrong problem. And particularly if it's a problem that I've avoided dealing with, my experience when I solve the right problem is it's nearly always a relief. Even though it may be painful to face that thing, it's nearly always a relief because there's this feeling of real hope that comes in, because you can feel you're actually dealing with the right thing now. And even if that thing is difficult and overwhelming or embarrassing or awkward, whatever it is coming up with it, there's also the sense of like, we're actually dealing with the thing. And that there's a certain peace and a certain relief that comes from that.
Yeah, I agree. So let's say someone's listening to this conversation and they hear everything you're saying, and maybe they've researched what you do and your story has motivated them, but they just feel stuck or sick or broken. What is it that you want them to hear?
There's a difference between feeling broken and being broken. It is. I was working with a patient just this last week who was going through a really tough time, like really in the fire of the hard stuff to do. And they were like, I feel like I'm just not doing the work, like it's not working. And I was like, this is what healing looks like and feels like. It's like when it's this hard, this is when we know you're really doing the work. And there's something about that which is, again, it's kind of a relief. It's like, and we can feel something intensely, but it doesn't make it true. And it's really important to feel that thing. Like, for example, I mentioned earlier, growing up without a dad. And then many years later, I sort of realized that absence and started sort of opening up to that loss. And as I did that, part of my feeling was I wanted to kill my father. Now, that feeling was very visceral, was very intense, and was very real. That didn't mean I actually was going to kill my father, or that in everything said I actually wanted to, but I had an intense feeling of rage and hate and hurt and all of the feelings that came from having been abandoned in that way. So we can feel something, and we often need to really feel it to be able to move through it. But I always want to make the distinction that feeling your feelings doesn't mean that you can validate the feeling without having to buy the story that overlays the feeling. And often what we think is if I'm feeling, the story about the feeling must be true. And often the story about the feeling isn't true, and therefore we reject the feeling. So if we can separate the validity of the feeling, but have a looser hold on the story, we can more deeply feel the feeling. And as we do that, we can then start to unpack, well, what's actually true in the story?
Wow. That's powerful. Because I think a lot of times we allow ourselves to believe the idea that feelings are facts.
Right.
And they're not.
But they're still valid, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Those two things can be true. If you could describe healing in 3 words, what would they be?
Painful, energizing, and liberating.
That's a good 3. That's a really good 3. If there's one thing that you want to be known for that would define your legacy, what would you want that to be?
I was having a conversation with a friend of mine recently, actually, about this. And for me, the kind of guiding kind of principle in a way that I come back to is because, when one has a little bit of sort of public profile, it's very easy for one to get caught in that, or get caught in one's achievements or one's accomplishments or how one sees one. But I've met many people over the years that have public profiles quite disconnected from who they are on a day-to-day kind of human level. What to me is most important is just being a good person, like being a loving father, being a loving husband, doing things in the world with integrity that have meaning, and working hard to do that. And I feel like everything else can be a product of that. But that to me is what matters the most.
Mm-hmm. I think if that is what you're striving for, that's an excellent goal. And I mean, if someone was to look at you, I don't think there's a big difference between who you are publicly and who you are inside, because you seem to reflect what you're doing internally, externally. So I appreciate that, and appreciate all the work that you're doing.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that.
All right, last question for you. If you could use your platform to educate anyone who might be struggling with their mental or emotional health and might be uncertain of how or where to start, what would you say?
I think one has to start with a little bit going back to where we started this conversation with my story. One has to move from being the victim of the circumstance that's happening to becoming responsible for creating the change. I have this phrase I like of becoming captain of the ship of one's healing journey. It doesn't mean you have to do everything yourself. It doesn't mean you don't have people that are supporting you. But, you know, and in a way, it's a bit like what we were saying about feelings and the stories about the feelings. Like, two things can be true at the same time. We can be a victim, but we're all a victim of what's happened to us. And we have to validate those places inside of us, right? Like the younger, wounded, hurt parts of us need to be held and validated and seen in where they are. And we can't live in that place, because as much as we need to hold the younger parts of us, we also have to recognize that we're an adult. And as an adult, we have adult responsibilities. And adult responsibilities mean that no one's going to do this healing work for us. And just because other people screwed up and, you know, got things wrong or whatever that story may be, we are where we are now. And if we make our healing journey as important as we deserve it to be made, we can heal. It may not be a straight path. It may not be that we find the miracle answer, but whatever we put the most energy into in our life is likely to be the area that we see the most movement. And so there's a big difference between blame and responsibility. This is not about blaming people for their circumstances at all. Quite the opposite. In fact, I wrote a book called "It's Not Your Fault." So I'm definitely not on the side of blame. And there is something amazing that happens when we take real responsibility for our healing work. We get energized by that. You know, we get empowered by that. And then we see that we do the work and some things start to change. And, you know, that's like the crack cocaine of, not I've ever tried crack cocaine, but it's like the crack cocaine of healing work. It's like you go, holy cow, like I actually do this work. And actually that thing that was really hard doesn't feel so hard. And then it raises the possibility of like, well, what would our life look like if we went all in doing this work?
Wow. Thank you for that. I think anyone who listens to what you just said or this entire conversation would be inspired by your story, by your wisdom, and by the methodology behind what you have defined as healing. So thank you for that.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the conversation.
If anybody wanted to find you online or on social media, where could they find you?
Probably the best place to go that signposts everything is my website, alexhoward.com. That points towards the Optimum Health Clinic, our professional trainings in therapeutic coaching, to my various online courses and programs. And I'd always just say, if I can, a really good place to find out more about my work as well is to go to YouTube and just search "In Therapy" with Dr. Alex Howard. And there's now, I think, about 13 seasons of me working with real life patients doing therapeutic work. And I think more than anything I've done, it really captures the essence of what you and I are talking about today, which is when people do the work and they have some good, hopefully good support doing that, what change looks like and what can become possible. So that's a great place, people, to sort of see this work come alive.
I'll make sure I add that in the show notes. And then what about your books as well?
Yeah, my two most recent books. So my book on fatigue is called Decode Your Fatigue, and it's available on sort of Amazon and good bookstores, whatever we say. Amazon's not the only place to buy books. And then my most recent book, It's Not Your Fault, Why Childhood Trauma Shapes You and How to Break Free, is my book on the impacts of childhood trauma on adult development, the critical role of the nervous system, but also super practical in terms of things that people can do to heal.
Sure. All right, man. Well, I really, really appreciate this conversation. I appreciate who you are. I appreciate you agreeing to do this with me. And I'm really, really grateful for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate the conversation.